Welcome to this special episode of the Danger Close podcast. Over the next few weeks, I'll be answering listener and viewer questions about the novels in the lead up to the publication of Red Sky Mourning, available June 18th, 2024. Will there be spoilers? Absolutely. Be sure and stay tuned after the Q&A to listen to Ray Porter read the prologue. This episode of the Danger Close podcast is brought to you by Bravo Company Manufacturing. Here we go. Q&A for Only the Dead. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Absolutely love reading these and answering these. This comes from Instagram, the Jack of Spades. What made you decide to include an entire chapter about the long lesson in economics? I think I'm still recovering from the research that I did into finance, economics, and how all that plays in, because it was important to highlight how the collective and how an elite portion of society has accumulated great wealth really since, well, before World War II, but in this particular case, when I'm talking about this book, since the formation of a group called the Collective in the latter part of World War II, how they accumulated such great wealth and power. So that meant I needed to understand, and James Reese needed to understand, which meant I had to have it explained to him because he's not really a numbers guy. So I had it explained to him the way it would be explained to me, but that took a lot of work because I am not a finance guy. And like I said, I think I'm still recovering from that. But what I did after I did all the research and wrote it out, then I sent it to a couple people who have worked on Wall Street their entire lives and live and breathe finance. And so I said, I want someone who has lived the life that you guys have. I want this to resonate with them. I want them to know that at least you put in the effort to get this right. And so I wanted some insider lingo. I wanted it to read true to someone that has dedicated their life to that profession. So that's what I did. And it was much more in depth than I thought it was going to get, but that's just how it goes. So I learned a ton doing that. And just thinking about it now, I'm getting tired. And if you read that, you probably know why, especially if you're not a finance person, because it was pretty in depth. Here we go. This is Summer SA11. Did the sauna fight scene in the movie Eastern Provinces influence the spa fight in this book? And it didn't, other than I was aware of it, meaning I saw that movie when it came out. So it's been out for a while now. I can't even remember when exactly I saw it. And then also Red Heat with Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the 80s. So I was either in, late junior high or maybe early high school days. I can't remember exactly, but I haven't seen that since it came out either. And in both of those films, there's a fight scene that involves a sauna and Russians. So it influenced only in that it's a part of my experience, but I didn't rewatch them or anything like that in preparation for the fight scene in the sauna. I just needed something. I needed a location that would work for the characters that I created. And, this fit it to a T. And I talk about it in the acknowledgments to the book, but I was out on the East Coast and going to visit a friend and just having a drink on his back deck. And another friend came over and we started talking, and, I hadn't figured out where that fight scene was going to take place or what was going to happen yet in that portion of the novel. And they mentioned this place in New York. And so that one's how, and I took note. And so I thanked them in the acknowledgments to Only the Dead. Here we go. Snow Crow 86. Any special reason you chose Boston, Cape Cod? And so it needed to be in that part of the world because I needed to get the characters there. And I talk about this a little bit in my podcast with RFK Jr., with Robert Kennedy Jr., and talk about this wedding that I went to in Hyannisport. So on the East Coast, general vicinity, not the same exact place, but same part of the world. And a friend of mine was marrying into the Kennedy family, so I went back there, went to the Kennedy compound, got to spend some time with Ethel Kennedy, actually escorted her into a section of a part of the ceremony. And so being in that house and looking at a picture of John F. Kennedy when the election results were coming in, and then looking at where the picture was taken and seeing a set of stairs in the picture and then looking to that exact set of stairs and realizing you're in the exact place where he watched the election results come in, was pretty powerful. So, Ethel Kennedy actually inspired that part of the novel. And so I tucked it away. So that wedding took place in the summer of 2017. And so I tucked that away for future use, and knew that it would be part of a future novel. So that's where that came from. So that's the special reason. Here we go. This is also from Instagram at 2aways. This book saw Reese questioning himself after his solitary confinement, but once he dives into work, it goes all away. What's the next step for Reese's character development? Will we see him come to terms with the actions of the past books? And that's a very good question. You should definitely read Red Sky Mourning, coming out June 18th. So that was going into solitary confinement was something that I wanted to do. I needed to put him in that situation, learn a little bit more about himself, go into his memories, endure that because he was going to have to use that experience later in the novel. And this is from Stuart Gebby9. How do you keep coming up with such amazing action and torture scenes? Thank you. I just put a lot of thought into it and try to make them different enough from previous novels, different from other things that I've seen out there, to really dive into my own experience, and make them as authentic and as real as I possibly can to drive the story forward. So, a lot of times I like to think they're more than just action sequences, in that the character, particularly James Reese, is learning things through them, because we're all learning things when we're from any sort of adversity that we go through. That becomes part of our experience. We learn from it. We adapt. Maybe we apply those lessons going forward as wisdom. So they're all part of his collective experience now. All right, here we go. From X here, and this is from BM Eastwood. I was mesmerized by the maritime mission with Reese and Israeli Flotilla 13. That's their version of the SEALs. Reese is, after all, a SEAL, and we know how good he is on land. What about the sea? Now we know. Can we expect another undersea mission in future novels? Stay tuned. Check out Red Sky Mourning. All right. Here we go. This is from J Falcon 7166. Did Peter Zion help with the geopolitics of this book? Looking at the world right now, it's pretty crazy how close things got. And yeah, Peter Zion comes into a few different novels. First in True Believer, and in the latest novel, Red Sky Mourning, that's coming out soon. And I talk about this in the author's note or the acknowledgments, I think in the author's note. But I talk about the parts that he influenced in this, and the character that I attribute some of Peter's insights to, and that's Andy Danreb. So same character that has those types of insights in True Believer. So in this book, anytime that there is something that's geopolitical, there might be Peter's fingerprints on it, depending on who it's coming from, of course. The Sig Sauer P365 X Macro. Slim and easily concealable. 3.7-inch barrel or a compensated 3.1-inch barrel. Expansion chamber slide reduces muzzle rise by up to 30%. M1913 Picatinny rail for accessories. Nitron-coated finish. X-ray 3 sights for precise sight acquisition, day or night. Patented 17+1 capacity magazine. The Sig Sauer P365 X Macro, the choice of James Reese and me, Jack Carr. This is from Backdraft Live. Do you think Reese came out of solitary a different man? Or did he strengthen his mental iron lockbox to allow him to compartmentalize the stress he continuously endures? Is James Reese still James Reese? And so I don't know if he came out a different man, but once again, it's a part of his experience. And so I don't think there was a metamorphosis that takes place there, but it's important for characters in these stories as they evolve to go through tests, to go through trials, to, in the hero's journey, go into the cave and emerge transformed. Not necessarily a new person, because they have all that collective experience leading into whatever trial and tribulation they now endure, and then they emerge perhaps somehow different, maybe wiser, maybe not. So it all depends on the character. But in this case, certainly not a new person, still the character of James Reese, but now with this new experience on which to draw from. And here we go from Facebook, and this is from Hunter Filthin. Do you ever write something and then go back and redact it yourself for security reasons? And not yet. I didn't really do, people think that in special operations or the SEAL teams, you are exposed to all this top secret stuff. And that really wasn't my experience. My experience in the SEAL teams was doing the same things that any big city SWAT team is going to do on the night that you're listening to this or watching this, kicking indoors in the middle of the night. Before they do that, putting together target packages and patterns of life, making sure they're going to the right place at the right time, that the target's there, or if they're trying to get to someone else, that they're going after someone else in, let's say, that crime family or that syndicate, so that they can put another piece of that puzzle together to get to where they want to go, build their case, that sort of a thing. Very similar in Iraq and Afghanistan. Only difference is you're essentially in a denied area, non-permissive environment. You might have an AC-130 overhead. You might have some sort of a Reaper type UAV overhead. You have those sorts of things. Maybe you have an Abrams tank or a Bradley fighting vehicle. So you have those sorts of assets at your disposal. But at the base level, you're still kicking someone's door in the middle of the night, grabbing them out of bed, taking them back for questioning to go get the next guy. So very similar. So there's nothing that I've redacted for security reasons up to this point. And it kind of leads into the next question here that you have. Do you ever worry about any of your stories inspiring bad actors or putting the good guys at risk in reality? And no, because I don't want that to influence the story. The primary thing that I think about as I'm writing is that someone's trusting me with time that they're never going to get back. And if I'm putting limitations on myself, that means I'm putting limitations on the story, and I'm not honoring the story, which means I am not respecting the time of those people who are spending that time with me, either reading or listening to the novel. So that's not something that I think about as I write. For me, it's all about the story. Have you ever received any fan mail from anyone who has been inspired to pursue a career in the military, law enforcement, or any other related service profession after reading your novels? And yes, now. So not for the first one, not for the second one, third one. COVID happened, so there wasn't a book tour. But when I went back on book tour for In the Blood, that was the first time that the books had been out there long enough now for people who read them at age 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 to then decide what they were going to do for maybe their life. Maybe it's their path for the rest of their life. Maybe not. Maybe it's a portion of their life. But to have joined the military, to have become a police officer, to have become a firefighter, to have gone into the intelligence services. So I started hearing that, and I knew it might come one day because that was my experience watching the films that I watched growing up, reading the books that I read growing up. Those significantly impacted me and my choices in life. They became a part of my foundation upon which to build. So I kind of had it in the back of my mind that at some point that might happen. I didn't really spend more time than that thinking about it, but for the book tour for In the Blood, that was the first time where people came up to me and said, hey, I read this book when I was a senior in high school. I was a junior in high school. I'm 3 years into my time in the military, or I'm now a police officer because I read this. And so that was, it's incredibly humbling to hear that from those guys. So, so very, very cool. It's kind of, you don't really know how to react to it other than just to thank them for stepping up and doing what they do. And that is it for this one. So that's it for Only the Dead. Thank you to everyone who put the time, energy, and effort into writing these questions. I sincerely appreciate it. You can keep listening to hear Ray Porter narrate the prologue of Only the Dead. You can go to officialjackcarr.com, check out the new merch there, and click and subscribe to the podcast as well. Join me next week for a Q&A on Red Sky Mourning. No spoilers. It comes out June 18th, 2024. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care out there. Stay safe. Be strong. Keep fighting.
At the behest rest of the CIA administration continues.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine pushes into its second year.
A Wall Street firm denied any connection to Russian organized
President
crime.
Christensen was laid to rest today in Arlington.
Augmented by the private military contracting firm Wagner Group.
Only the Dead, a novel of truth and consequences. The sixth novel in the James Reese Terminal List series.
Prologue. Newport, Rhode Island, 1980. Walter Stowe deftly piloted the 36-foot trawler through Vineyard Sound, past Nashawena Island, and into Rhode Island Sound. He kept Castle Hill Lighthouse to the boat's starboard side as he navigated a northeasterly course toward their destination. He had become quite adept at maneuvering small watercraft in dangerous waters, though the seas between Edgartown Yacht Club on Martha's Vineyard and Station 10, the New York Yacht Club's property in Newport, were not nearly as dangerous as the waters he had navigated 10 years earlier, inserting and extracting Navy SEALs in the Mekong Delta. The route ahead clear, Walt turned from the helm to look at his wife. Martha sat behind him on the flybridge, her tan legs outstretched on the cushioned, aft-facing bench seat, her face upturned to catch the fading rays of the late summer sun. Trawler was a bit of a misnomer. It was a Grand Banks 36, and though it resembled the trawlers of Walt's youth, this vessel was built with comfort and touring in mind, not hauling in a catch in the hopes of making ends meet. A more than capable craft, bloody decks were foreign to her. This boat was built to impress the East Coast's prestigious yachting community. The boat was hers, or, to be more precise, it belonged to her family. A family of means. A family with history. Martha's grandfather had made his money investing in commodities. He had then used that fortune to purchase commercial real estate in New York City. It was rumored that he had run a profitable bootlegging business during Prohibition. That mythology naturally led to whispers of mob connections in Manhattan and Chicago. Her family had even been accused of delivering the Windy City vote in a presidential election for another high-profile Massachusetts family 2 decades earlier, when Martha was still in middle school. She had never witnessed her father or grandfather dispel those rumors. She suspected that a connection to the mob, real or imagined, didn't hurt in certain business dealings. While blue blood ran strong through her stock, Martha had diluted the perceived nobility of the line when she married Walter. The Stowes were seafarers. Walt and his brothers had grown up fishing and checking traps off the coast of Cape Cod. Most people associate lobsters with Maine, but as Walt and his brothers knew, wooden lath traps were first used in their Massachusetts home waters in 1810. The traps Walt would use over a century later operated in much the same fashion as their predecessors. A lobster would be lured through a funnel, unable to resist the temptation of the mackerel and herring bait. The smaller crustaceans could escape through vents, but the larger ones would remain imprisoned in their wood and metal cells until Walt and his brothers pulled them to the surface. Wychmere Harbor in Harwich Port was their base of operations, and in a fickle industry with innumerable variables, Walt learned that in some years the catch was not enough to feed a young family. He watched as his father took odd jobs around town to make ends meet, working as a handyman and bartender as finances and seasons dictated. The man never complained. From bull raking for little neck clams to chasing striped bass to roofing, shingling, and a bit of carpentry, the elder Stowe put food on the table and a roof over the heads of his wife and sons. All three Stowe boys believed their paths were preordained. The sea was calling. That was, until they started hearing about a country called Vietnam. Because the United States never formally declared war on North Vietnam, Walt's older brother was one of the 2.2 million Americans conscripted for service in Southeast Asia under the peacetime draft established by the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. The working-class Stowe family knew it was only a matter of time before Walt was drafted, so his father recommended his middle child enlist in the Navy. Rather than rolling the dice with the Army, the elder Stowe believed a ship off the coast would be a much safer way to ride out a tour in Vietnam. Neither Walt nor his father had ever heard of the Brown Water Navy. Within the year, Walt found himself on a Mark II PBR in the Mekong Delta, learning the ropes from a weathered first-class petty officer, the boat's captain. Walt and the captain were augmented by a gunner's mate to run and maintain the twin 50-caliber machine guns and an engine man to keep the new Jacuzzi water jet propulsion system operational. With the 50s in the bow and a 30-caliber M1919AH mounted to the stern, along with a hand-cranked Mark 18 40x46 mm grenade launcher, the patrol boat and crew of river rats operated throughout South Vietnam's extensive river systems, which cut through the country from the South China Sea all the way to Cambodia. With roads and rail lines still in rudimentary stages of development, it was the veins of rivers and canals that provided the lifeblood of Vietnam's economy via access to resources. Those who controlled the waterways controlled the country. It was upon returning from a patrol that he received a letter from his mother letting him know that his younger brother had been drafted by the country's first lottery. He wouldn't last 3 weeks in Vietnam. Walt's commanding officer summoned Walt to his hooch in April 1970 to inform him of his brother's death. That same officer would summon him back a week later with news that Stowe was going home. His older brother was also dead, one of 1,448 service members to be killed on their last day in country, and making the Stowe family one of 31 families to lose 2 brothers in the conflict. Walt had a mission growing up in a family of lobstermen, and he had a mission in the Navy. The deaths of his siblings changed the course of his life and gave it new purpose. He returned from Vietnam and made use of the GI Bill, attending the State University of New York while working odd jobs in the city and earning his degree in 3 years. Walt could smoke dope and protest, or he could make changes from the inside. He chose to head into government. He thought his path to instigating change would be through the State Department, believing he could work his way up the ranks and help prevent another war that he viewed as a waste of blood and treasure, needless and avoidable, a permanent scar on the nation. He soon learned that rising to a position of influence would take longer than his patience would allow, and that coveted ambassadorships were, for the most part, reserved for campaign donors and for people with recognizable last names. Ambassadors did not come from families who trolled and checked traps. They came from those who paid top dollar for the catch to be served at private dinner parties in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th homes from the Hamptons to Martha's Vineyard. He needed another avenue if he wanted to keep his government in check. He found it in politics. The State Department had opened that door, as it was at a State Department function that he met Martha Sterling. Looking like she would rather have been anywhere else, her outward demeanor matched Walt's internal disposition. They hit it off immediately. All Martha's sisters had been married off to suitors approved of, and possibly arranged by, her father. Suitors from other prominent, connected East Coast families of means, influence, and generational wealth. Martha was the problem child. Brown University, a Peace Corps mission to India, and anti-war protests across the nation formed the foundation of her rebellious tendencies. Men with what her parents and grandparents considered the right pedigree bored her to tears. Walt was the one. Plus, he was a lobsterman. Her parents would hate that. But rather than be disavowed, Walt was accepted into the family. Martha suspected it was because her father thought he might end up being useful. It couldn't hurt to have a politician in the family, especially if you funded his campaign. Favors. Walt proposed under a tree she had climbed as a child on the Sterling's estate on Martha's vineyard, and they were married on the property the following spring. Walt knew less than a third of those in attendance, but he was well aware that he was marrying more than Martha. He was marrying into something bigger. Martha tilted her head back, admiring her husband at the wheel. They had been married for just over 6 years and had 2 children to show for it. As a congressman from Massachusetts' 12th district, elected to the House just 2 years prior, Walter's star was on the rise. His background resonated with blue-collar workers, and his new affiliation with one of America's wealthiest and most connected families immersed him in the world of the political elite. He had already made waves as a staffer for Representative Otis Pike of New York, who led the United States House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Better known as the Pike Committee, it was established to investigate overreach by certain agencies of the federal government, including the FBI, NSA, and CIA. The Pike Committee was the House's version of the Senate's Church Committee, a key difference being that while the findings of the committee chaired by Senator Frank Church were made public, the findings of the Pike Committee were suppressed for reasons of national security. It was as part of those investigations that Walt began to have recurring meetings that were not recorded on his official or personal calendars. At first, Martha thought he might be having an affair. That would not have been unusual for a man in his position. Martha's father was a well-known philanderer. Both of her sisters' husbands had strayed, but her sisters had, of course, looked the other way, as had their mother, following Jackie Kennedy's, now Jackie O's, example. Secrets. Martha despised secrets. She came from a family of secrets and swore she would not continue the tradition. She and her husband were partners. With Walt's reputation as a man of the people, along with his political instincts and her family's fortune, they were a team. She was not about to be relegated to the back seat, as her mother and sisters had been. As the former Navy man guided the boat around Fort Adams and into Brenton Cove, she thought back to the night she had begun to unravel the mysteries of his clandestine world. They had been staying in her family's Upper East Side building when he abruptly announced that he needed to meet with a potential donor late one evening. He had been having more of those recently. Meetings at odd hours meant a mistress in her experience. She was disappointed, but not surprised. She hailed a cab, seconds behind his. "Follow that cab." "Are you serious?" Her look told her driver that she was. "Okay, lady." Walt's cab headed west through Central Park via the 79th Street transverse and then took a right in the direction of the Upper West Side. "Where are you going?" A few blocks later, his cab pulled over. She watched her husband exit the yellow vehicle and run across the street, quickly ducking into another taxi. Thrusting a $20 bill at her driver, she asked him to make a U-turn. "It's illegal," he said. She shoved another 20 in his face. He cranked the wheel to a chorus of blaring horns. Walt's new cab maneuvered through traffic toward the Hudson River, turning south onto State Route 9A. Fortunately for Martha, she was in the most common vehicle in New York. She was invisible.
Who is she? Do I confront her? Him? Of course I do. Bastard.
They continued south past Hell's Kitchen, Chelsea, and the meatpacking district before making a U-turn on Clarkson Street and cutting right on Morton into Greenwich Village. Walt's cab then took a left on Bedford Street and came to a stop in front of a lime green building sandwiched between two brownstones, marked only with the number 86 in the West Village.
Keep driving,
Martha ordered, turning in her seat as her husband exited his cab and stepped onto the curb.
Pull over here,
she said. Whatever you say. She watched Walt approach the dark wooden door and disappear inside. Meter's running, lady.
Keep it running. Stay. Go inside. Leave. Turn a blind eye.
She glanced down at the gold Girard-Perregaux watch on her wrist.
10 minutes.
She snatched 2 more 20s from her purse, handed them to her cab driver, and pushed open the door. Martha walked to the nondescript structure and closed her eyes to steady herself in preparation of what she was certain she was about to witness. Then she reached for the handle. What greeted her was not row upon row of doors to apartments, nor a foyer, as she expected. Instead, she heard the hum of conversation, not between a man and a woman, but the low, steady drone of a crowd. She pushed the heavy red velvet curtain in front of her aside and stepped into a dark, smoke-filled room, poorly illuminated by dim lights on the walls and ceiling. 2 bartenders mixed drinks for patrons across a weathered wooden bar, and Martha noticed framed dust jackets adorning the walls of works from Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Salinger, Steinbeck, Cather, and Cummings. Tables lined the establishment with drinkers who looked to be regulars deep in conversation. Very few were women. One man with a stack of legal pads next to him seemed to be writing.
What is this place?
She took in the scene, her eyes shifting from the bar to the tables, until they settled on the corner booth. Walt's back was to her, but she recognized his jacket. She locked eyes with the man sitting across from him. The stranger wore a dark wool coat, its collar turned up, obscuring the lower part of his face. He zeroed in on the newcomer and then looked to Walt, who turned around. An expression of surprise was quickly replaced by resignation, and he waved her over. Stale air, thick with the smells of tobacco, sweat, and the damp, musty odor of whiskey barrels, parted way as she crossed the room. Walt scooted to the side under a framed dust jacket of Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy. "Martha," he said as she slid into the booth. "Welcome to Chumley's."
"Hello, darling," she said. "Charming place. Old speakeasy? It's good to see your meeting is not with a woman 10 years my junior."
She took stock of the man across the table. He wasn't smiling. The eyes weren't so much cold as they were perceptive and alert. Penetrating. She had not seen eyes like that before.
"I'm Martha Stowe,"
she said, more of a pronouncement, reaching across the table.
"And you are?"
The man's left hand was on the table, attached to a coffee mug. His right was out of sight. A stainless steel Rolex was on his wrist. When you grew up the way she did, you noticed things like that. The Rolex had become popular with Hollywood stars like Newman, Redford, and McQueen ever since Connery had given it screen time in his early outings as Bond. The dive watches were even starting to adorn the wrists of New York City's financial class. But unlike the ones she had seen worn by Wall Street bankers, this crystal was worn and scratched. Walt looked at his companion and raised an eyebrow. The man nodded. "True name?" Walt asked. The man's eyes had not left Martha's. He nodded again. "Martha, this is Tom Reese."
"Mr. Reese, I'm Martha Stowe. It's a pleasure to meet you. What, pray tell, are you and my husband discussing this evening?
Tom had hesitated, then reached his right hand across the table. Mrs. Stowe, he acknowledged, clearly less than pleased at the intrusion.
Call me Martha, please. If you are working with my husband on what I think you are, you can use my first name.
Martha, he said.
May I call you Tom?
You may.
Are you married?
Martha, Jesus, Walter said, shaking his head.
Well, if you are meeting surreptitiously with someone who I can only assume is either a reporter or works for one of our government agencies, I'd like to know what he has to lose. He doesn't look like a reporter.
She turned back to the man across the table. His eyes took measure, evaluating, thoughtful. She caught a flicker of acceptance as he moved his left hand to his coat pocket and removed a pack of Marlboro Reds. He shook out a cigarette and placed the filtered end between his lips. He then tossed the pack on the table and pulled a worn silver Zippo lighter from his right pocket. As the flint wheel ignited the wick, she noted an insignia on its side, a red shield highlighted in yellow with what looked like a skull wearing a green beret. She couldn't quite make out the letters at its base, but the last three appeared to be S-O-G.
Well?
Well? Tom asked before taking a long drag on his cigarette. Am I married? Not yet. She thought she caught the hint of a smile, as if a fond memory had risen from his subconscious.
I see. So you have nothing to lose.
We all have something to lose.
How right you are. I'll be direct. Anything you are doing, any trouble you may cause, doesn't just impact you. It impacts me. It impacts my children. It impacts my family. I just want us to be clear. Are we clear, Tom?
We are.
Good. Now what do I need to know?
That had been 5 years ago. Tonight, Walt would give a speech at the New York Yacht Club's Newport Clubhouse. He was young, but there were already talks of his future as a presidential hopeful, so campaigning outside of Massachusetts was good business. The comparisons to Camelot were not unfounded. An attractive political couple, a war veteran, who happened to have served on the modern equivalent of a PT boat, and a family connected to bootlegging and the mob. If they played their cards right, there was the possibility of a run for the White House. The country missed Camelot. It was still 2, possibly even 4 election cycles away, but in politics, you had to play the long game. After the speech and an hour of shaking hands, she planned to retire to their room while Walt would excuse himself and relocate to the White Horse Tavern for a drink and a bite to eat. There he would meet with Tom Reese. Walt did not share everything with his wife, but he shared enough. He thought it would alleviate her worries. In fact, it did the opposite. The church committee's report and what had been leaked from the Pike Committee had exposed the dark underbelly of the intelligence community to the American public. She knew that it had also illuminated something more. Martha understood that she did not have the full picture of what Walt was doing in his meetings with the man she now knew worked for the CIA, the very agency at the center of the investigations. Her husband had emerged as a strong and ardent voice for reform on the campaign trail for the passage of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The threat was communism, and those in power at the highest levels of the country's intelligence apparatus would stop at nothing to curtail its advance, to include encroaching on the rights and privacy of U.S. citizens, politicians, reporters, and Supreme Court justices. What else had Walt learned in the course of the House investigations? What was it that kept him awake? She had arisen in the middle of the night on multiple occasions to find him standing at the window, a bourbon in hand, staring into the night. Was it nightmares? The war? Work? What was it that scared him enough to go outside of official channels to meet with a renegade CIA officer? What was he doing with Tom Reese? She knew they had met in Vietnam when Tom was a SEAL and had reconnected in the course of events surrounding the Pike Committee. She assumed that he was a source, but Walt kept the specifics of their dealings close. There were some matters he was not allowed to discuss with her, or so went the line. She could tell he was keeping things from her for her own protection. He promised he would tell her one day soon, that he just needed a little more time, an explanation she accepted as much as she disliked it. Walt pulled back on the throttle and decreased speed, first to 10 knots and then to 5 as they approached the long dock extending from the manicured grounds of the club. Martha stood and joined her husband at the helm. "Want a docker?" he asked.
"You know I do,"
she smiled. With the children in the care of multiple nannies at her parents' estate on Martha's Vineyard, they were free. Well, almost free. Campaigning was still work, but she knew it was in pursuit of the ideals she had shouted for in the anti-war rallies of the late 1960s. Rather than just be the recipient of the wealth her family had accumulated and live a life parading from one social event to the next, she would have real influence. She could prevent conflicts like the war in Vietnam from happening again. She could fight to ensure that her children, and one day her grandchildren, would not die in an ill-conceived war, as had Walt's brothers. Martha was confident behind the controls of the yacht and knew the waters in between the island and Newport the way most people know the roads of their hometowns. Slipping the boat into neutral, she coasted toward the berth while Walt descended to the starboard side deck, pushing rubber fenders over the side to prepare for docking. They were an hour early, which would allow them time to freshen up before the evening's event. She then moved the throttle into reverse and guided the craft alongside the pier. Walt leapt from the boat to the dock, pulling the bowline taut and expertly lashing it to a cleat. He did the same with the stern line, examining his work to be sure the boat was secure before reboarding the vessel. "Great job," he called up to his wife on the flybridge.
"I know, dear."
Walt disappeared below deck to retrieve their overnight bags. Martha shut down the engines. "Ready?" Walt called up as he emerged from the trawler's interior.
"Give me a minute,"
she said, rummaging through a storage compartment in search of her purse. She heard the gate to the pier open and glanced up to see a man with a clipboard walking down the dock, the harbor master coming to greet them. "Hello," she heard her husband say. "Mind if I pass you these bags? Alan not working tonight?" When Martha turned and looked back down at the dock, the harbor master was no longer holding a clipboard. In his outstretched hand was a pistol with a long cylindrical attachment she knew as a silencer. Walt slowly raised his hands and shook his head. "Don't," the assassin fired. Due to the downward angle, the round entered near the top of Walter's head. It cut its way through the frontal, parietal, and occipital lobes, removing a large portion of the back of his skull on the way out, coating the lower portions of the side bridge windows with gray brain matter and bone fragments. Martha heard her husband's lifeless body drop straight to the deck. Visions of her 2 young children overwhelmed her and locked her in place. Paralyzed and unable to react, she witnessed the assassin fire 2 additional suppressed rounds into her husband. As the business end of the weapon swung upward, she gazed from the black pistol to her executioner's dead eyes. Italian? Russian? Martha was a good 15 feet above the assassin. The setting sun was to her back. He held the pistol at her head and then dropped it to her upper chest and pressed the trigger. It felt like she had been hit with a sledgehammer, her body contorting around the entrance wound. The kids, Walter, her parents. As her body twisted, a swell rocked the boat and her knees buckled, which caused her to stumble backward and to the side. She felt another bullet impact her left arm and then had the brief sensation of falling. She collided with the safety rail that extended from the bulwark of the main deck before crashing into the waters of Brenton Cove. As Martha sank into the darkness, she found herself thinking of someone else. A man she knew had experience with violence. A man her husband would have seen later that evening. A man with ties to the military and to the Central Intelligence Agency. A man named Thomas Reese.
Until the next time, take care out there, stay safe, be strong, keep fighting.